Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about literacy. Literacy in the 19th century, literacy in the 20th century, literacy now, and how that impacts genealogically and what studies have been done that can really point us in the direction to what it meant and how it increased and what might have made it increase, external factors and so on. Literacy and numeracy skills are still with us today and very, very important. And our idea that literacy is very pronounced and everybody is able to read and write now and all sorts is very much at odds with our census information of 2013 that would show that 1 in 6 in Ireland have a problem with reading and writing. And that's today. So when we go back into the 19th century, and where we're looking at literacy, where we can see from studies that were done and dissertations that were written that very few people were reading and writing in the early part of the 19th century. You know, later on, there are different drivers for what makes them learn and write and how to read and write. Studies that have been done looking at the marriage certs and baptismal certs would look at, in England, would look at who signed and how could they sign and did they make a mark. And unfortunately in Ireland, that's a bit problematic because civil registration doesn't come in until 1864. So we may have had an increase in literacy prior to the famine, but we can't really prove it. But what we can do is probably emulate those studies and look at who was signing and what was happening. There are various different literature sources on literacy done that show that 87% of people were able to read and write by the late 19th century. A little bit problematic, I would say, given the fact deriving the data from the educational sources at the time might be very difficult. And going to school wouldn't have been enforced as much. I don't see records in the petty court sessions of people checking on school going until the early 20th century. So therefore, how can you test the literacy as such by school attendance and things like that? So there's lots of measures that need to be done. Why is it important? Well, it's important because some of the drivers could be that between 1890 and 1917, we still had a great deal of emigration from Ireland to the US. But what we have is measures in the US which are designed to make sure that only the literate are getting into America. So they bring in a literacy test. So that may have been a great driver for people to have to be able to read and write so that they would actually pass the literacy test on emigrating to the United States. And it also may have diverted the traffic to other countries. If they were not going to be able to read and write, they might not go to the United States. So this is something I had not been aware of until I was actually researching for the show today. And it's quite interesting that you have external factors doing that. So literacy in the mid-18th century, the only books which reached genuine national audiences would have been religious, Bibles, prayer books, catechisms. By the end of the 19th century, in certain countries, people were buying and borrowing books. And, you know, you had a homogenous reading public that had been created, and there was a distinctive learned literature. So we know from the increase of literature and popular texts and the romance novels and so on. And the likes of Charles Dickens, who would have wrote serials, because an awful lot of these books were created as serials when they started out. So you didn't get the whole lot of Hard Times or Nicholas Nickleby. You know, you ended up with part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5. So readers were very much increasing and born in the 19th century. And sometimes people learning how to read, it was because It was a means of making them change, and it was a way of moralizing the poor. And in the 19th century, a massive advice literature and health literature started to appear in churches through educators, librarians, and philanthropists were trying to get through working class to get the information through into safe channels. And we haven't stopped that today. So competing discourses about reading during the 19th century show plenty about what's happening, but they may tell us little about what our rural ancestors read. We do know that looking at studies, we see that people had a common need in the wintertime for heat and light and so on, and they would go to each other's houses, and that was done with oral culture, would have been a very strong feature, and a very strong feature in Irish society as well. And one of the sources that we can see for that is very much looking at the school's collection that would have been gathered, that you could see where the stories would gather together people in private houses, stables or barns. On a long cold evening, they would start telling each other stories, reciting popular legends, and really increasing the vernacular information that made things understandable, because each place has its own particular story as well. So very much what we're looking at in literacy is seeing what was the point of it, what was the cost of it. Low literacy costs. Studies show us that low literacy actually has a cost. High literacy has a gain. And there is human capital, which looks at literacy and education. So before the 20th century, relatively few people needed to be able to read and write. There were many jobs that people didn't need to be able to read and write for. And indeed, many of the upper classes feared educating the poor because it would teach them to become above themselves or become overskilled and dissatisfied with their lives and so on, and lead to social and unrest. So we have primary and secondary school education. Primary education would have been very much based on a fee-going basis. So we have the educational records in Ireland. And if you want to see an example of educational records, you could go to the Clare Library website and you could see how that works in relation to, you'd have maybe 5 or 6 schools in Fecal, 3 or 4 schoolmasters. What's happening with the national school system, which is one of the oldest in Europe, in Ireland. There have been accusations that it was used to convert people to Protestantism, and there is some truth in that, but it's just important to remember. So the place of girls also is something here. Most education was given to boys because they were expected to earn a living in order to support their families. Girls' education was considered to be of secondary importance. So some small schools would have taught girls accomplishments, designed them to attract a husband mainly, or perhaps to become a governess themselves. There's very little career routes for girls as such. So schools in the 19th century were often run, in some cases, by single women, and they, our schooling as we look at it can be very significant, because we can see that George Boole, the famous mathematician and father of modern day computing, he was teaching school at 15 or 16. So the age in which people taught school at and what they would have taught and literacy is very much important as well. So in census returns, if you want to know were your ancestors at school, children were noted as scholars. And the census result starts to tell whether people can read or write or not. And no satisfactory study has really been done on the 1901 and 1911 census on literacy, or taking it from a genealogical aspect. So it is something that we're looking into doing for a major study, because it's very significant on looking at what literacy means. It's not just why people are they reading for entertainment. It's not entertainment. if you can't get into America, if you can't pass a literacy test between 1890 and 1917, it's going to be a significant driver for Irish people from certain rural parts to be able to learn how to read. So these are the significant aspects of literacy today. What I found surprising was that we still have 1 in 6 with a problem with literacy today. So that is quite significant. Teachers, as they were being trained to teach you literacy, would have done it through a correspondence course. They wouldn't necessarily have gone to a teacher training college, which was on site. We've got to look at what the material was, which was reading literature or religious texts and bits and pieces would have been very important. So the Bible was a very significant part of the curricula for learning how to read and sources of what to read. And the popular newspapers became cheaper in the 19th century. So that led to a big significance as well, because suddenly people could afford newspapers who could never afford them before. So questions of how we look at literacy are very significant at the time. And by the end of the 19th century, it is estimated that 86% of the Irish population were literate. Nuanced understandings of what the literacy might entail complicate the statistic, as what I've said earlier on in this broadcast. It was nevertheless the case that, quote, the overwhelming majority of the population, especially those of working or school age, could read and write with basic competencies, and usually a great deal more than that. So that's written by Stephanie Rains, and a publication, Reading the Hand, Palmistry, Graphology and Alternative Literacy. So many in the 19th century became more significantly literate than their parents or the grandparents, and probably took over that role of doing a literal role and so on. So very much of what we're looking at is types of literacy, what people are learning, what's of value, what's becoming of value, and not to draw back on technological change, if you like. And we have to look at education, what's happening there, what the curriculum is. It's moving away from numeracy and moving into educational progress at that time. And so that's what's making it significant. You also have apprenticeships. Did they suddenly have to know how to read? Apprenticeships were changing. So guild apprenticeships were changing in the 19th century. The strict controls exercised over apprentices started to loosen in the mid-18th century. So many people did not complete their full term, but still practiced a trade. And with the growth of the large companies, apprentices were increasingly taken on by businesses instead of a single master. So you had shipbuilders, gas companies, and motor manufacturers. So surviving records of indentures from the 19th and 20th century, you can find them in family papers, and you can also find them in archives as well. Completing an apprenticeship was one of the ways after 1662 which to gain settlement in a parish. So even to be able to stay in a parish and so on was important. And literacy is very much, of course, tied into the professions. So you're not going to be able to have a legal trade if you cannot read or write. You can't go into the church if you can't read or write. So it's driven by the human capital, and you wouldn't go into medicine. So the signature professions are very much there as well. So any official administration is suddenly starting to require a great deal of literacy, probably a lot more than what it would have before. And this is because of the growth of technology, agriculture becoming more literacy based in many ways that it never would have before, and also the driving needs of emigration, that they're suddenly having to pass literacy tests to get into other countries. And that may divert their passage for what's going on and how they can manage and so on. So, you know, there are very few ancestors that that we don't have, that all of them were literate in bits and pieces, but we can certainly take note now when we look at the marriage certs, which are available on irishgenealogy.ie, and the birth indexes, as to whether they sign or whether they're leaving a mark, and what they're doing and what that's telling us at that time. So literacy is an absolutely fascinating subject. It's very important to see how it's been used, and you know, some fine scholars have done some work on this, and I'm looking at David Mitch's work. If you're looking at it, it's a good example to see the spread of literacy in 19th century England he looks at. So he looks at a study that would be nice to maybe emulate in Ireland, because in 1840 he has 2/3 of all grooms and half of all brides in England and Wales were able to sign their names at marriage. In 1900, 97% of each group were able to do so. So it had really come up. This increase contrasts with the, quote, rough constant proportion signing at marriage between 1750 and 1840. Historians, he says, have debated whether this upturn in literacy was the result of elite educational policy or working class demand. The changes and the cost and the benefits of acquiring literacy are something that he looks at. So the pecuniary from consumption benefits look at 8,000 marriage registers, and it would be very, and he looks at the roles, what they're able to do. Now that's going to very much differ in Ireland as to, and even the role of what you're allowed to say women do. So census tie-ins of what the changes are, and unfortunately survival of censuses are not there in Ireland for us to be able to give that type of information. We do actually have the 1900 and the 1911. So it'd be nice to see a comparative difference between the 1901 and the 1911 census, and see, is there any difference in literacy, roles, what's happening. We're certainly going to be investigating and doing studies like that. So today's show is very much about what we've looked at for literacy of reading and writing, and what we can expect to be able to do with that, and what's going on. The younger people, of course, can read and write. The older people perhaps cannot. In Ireland, we also have bilingualism coming into being, Irish being a language that is part of our ancestry as well. And so how that impacts on oral records is another matter as well. So just a few announcements. We'll be keeping going with the genealogy radio show and looking for projects and bits and pieces. We'll certainly be doing a literacy project from January 2022. We're going on with the UL co-op students again, and they have always given so much to the genealogy radio show. It's absolutely great. And we are looking for books and reviews and topics to research. So if you do want to send them on to me, please do. My email is merrimanresearch@gmail.com, and you can get it from the show as well. And we would welcome any topics that you'd like researched over the winter as well. We're very glad of your support, and very glad of the support of Radio Corcabashkin. And so that's all for today, folks. The show goes out today, and it'll go out and is recorded and podcast as well. So thanks very much for listening.